When we're speaking of mission in the church, we have to be concerned about knowing ourselves as church, who we are as church, what is the nature of church. I've spoken of this several times before. I want to come back to it now in a series of talks about the church and who we are as church. I'm Roger from the MSC Mission Office, and you're with Mission Alive. I want to begin by speaking about the Second Vatican Council. Now, a lot of people might think, well, that's a long time ago, it's about 60 years ago. But in fact, the consequences of the council have not yet been fully put into place in the church, and we need to get on with the job. Here's a series of reflections that will help us to understand what happened in that council. The Second Vatican Council ran from 1962 to 1965, and it was probably the third biggest change in the church's history, and it was probably the biggest change in the history of the church for perhaps 1,000 years. It's a significant change and points us to the future. So it introduced it recognized that there was a new world, a different time, a new situation, so it required a new response from the church. And so there's some new theology, new thinking and understanding, and a new perspective on the world and on itself, church in the world. One of the first the most important idea in the church, in the council at the time, it came to, in describing itself as church, it says the church's mystery of communion. Now, this is not new. This is going back to something that was known and lived out early in the church. And it's important to remember, these are not new ideas, but reclaiming ideas from the past. And the Extraordinary Synod of the Bishops in 1985 said the ecclesiology of communion is the central and fundamental idea of the Council's documents. I've talked before about communion and what that means, and we will talk a bit more in the future. We have to unpack those big words and see what it means see what they mean, and see what they mean for us in everyday life. Communion has a Trinitarian foundation, as I've said before. It's based in the Trinity, Father, Son and Spirit. And the Church's mystery of communion, and in the Council too, the Church reclaimed the idea that we are the people of God, which is an Old Testament idea which we inherited as New Testament people. We are the body of Christ, and I've spoken of that before. We are the body of Christ. And all in the church have baptismal dignity. All are baptized the same, and I'll look into that a little bit further down the track. And the church is motivated, is driven, is energized by a dynamic spirit, and that is important for us. This is more recently from Pope Francis in Curreda, Amazonia. In order to walk together, the church today needs a conversion to the synodal process, keeping in mind that the Pope is initiating a 3-year process of synod for the next 3 years. It needs to strengthen a culture of dialogue, reciprocal listening, spiritual discernment, consensus and communion, in order to find areas and ways of joint decision making and to respond to pastoral challenges. Often these documents at church have a lot of big words and complicated sentences. That's one of the difficulties of the church in explaining itself and writing a message. But we will try and break some of these things down. The important things for us, and considering Church of Communion, are those words there from Francis. A culture of dialogue. We talked about dialogue before. Reciprocal listening, which is what dialogue is. We listen to each other. Spiritual discernment, together. We discern together. what is right, what is wrong, what is our direction, consensus and communion. Consensus, we arrive at a point where we can agree as best as we can agree, and define all areas and joint and ways of joint decision making. How do we make decisions together, and therefore decisions that we can all agree with? And in this way we respond to the pastoral challenges of the world today. This is how we are as church. This is the direction that Pope Francis is pointing us in, and this is a way that was done in the early days of the church. Different types of words, but it was done in the early days of the church, and this is where we need to go. So part of our mission is living out these things and building the church that we need to build for today. Thank you for being with us.